Good morning. Daniel Schwartz here from Wisconsin. So, just some random facts. I get started off on some different ideas and start learning about things just out of pure curiosity. So, my mind the other day was thinking about, like, do people over in England, like the UK, do they have is private ownership a thing over there, or is it still kind of owned by the influential people, like the lords of the land? Is that kind of system still set up? And so I started looking into that, and yes, private ownership is, people can buy their own land and this and that, but that's not the main point of this, because I was just curious, and then that led me into another area that was even more interesting, which was called it's a law called proprietary estoppel. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I probably botched it because I never heard it said. I just read it. Proprietary estoppel, which is different from promissory estoppel. So the law is basically set up so that if you gave your word to somebody in the proprietary estoppel, if you have promised somebody to give them property, and then that person, you gave your word, you have a verbal agreement between the two of you. Let's say in the cases that went to court were normally like an estate was promised to a certain person, and the person stayed there and worked on that estate, paid for things out of their own pocket, acted as if it was their land for X amount of years, only to have the estate holder go back on their word. But in English law, by law, the person who the promise was made to receive property for X amount of work, or a certain promise made, and then you have to have proof of this situation was actually to your detriment. Like if you put your money into the estate to upkeep it, and let's say one guy who works on a farm for 30 years and he runs the farm, and he's the one keeping the operation going, and he is promised the property once the older person dies, and then the older person gets angry and writes a new will to cut that person out of the holdings. By law, that person, being able to prove that they lived there for 30 years operating, putting their own money in, by law that person needs to be compensated, because a promise was made and this person acted upon the promise to his own detriment. And then the landholder went back on his word. And so then if the landowner promises somebody the property, and then this somebody invests their life into the property, and then at the end of a set amount of time the landowner goes back on their word, that is the same as stealing or like withholding wages. I thought that was really cool. So basically this English law, it was tried to be abused, commercially by some people, and it's a lot harder to abuse it commercially because commercial agreements and stuff usually require a written document that is signed, or a legal contract that is signed and wrote down. But when it comes to domestic promises, that is where this law really comes into play. So that protects people from being abused by their elders who want them to stay on and work the property as if it is their own and take responsibility as if it is their own, and then in the end they don't want to compensate them after all. And in some cases, if the person was there for the law was, you got to balance it out. Let's say like one family, one of the cases that led to this law that I was reading about was, one family, the one person stayed on the old place and worked it and did a lot of things, but other siblings also contributed a lot. So this person didn't actually end up getting the whole property when it was said and done, but he was compensated monetarily for the work that he had put in over the years and the upgrades that he had made. He was paid out of the estate. Very cool. So that's English law though. So I started like, is there an American counterpart? So there kind of is, but the American counterpart isn't quite as easy to uphold. But in America, if you have given a verbal promise and both parties have agreed to it, it is legally binding if it can be proved. You do not have to have a written contract, but the burden of evidence is upon the complainant. If a promise is made, a verbal agreement, in America, I think it's a little more broad. Like, even if, let's say, you went somewhere, you had a face-to-face meeting, like a job interview, and you were promised the job verbally, and you can prove it, and then they back out, you have to be compensated. So I never knew this, but just because you didn't write it down does not mean it is not legally binding. If you have given your word and both parties agree, it is legally binding. The tough part is that it's not impossible to prove, but it's a lot more expensive to prove because your lawyer, your legal representative has to do a lot more work to prove it. And that's usually the sticking point. It's one person's word against the other, and a lot of people just don't want to walk down that path and spend all those hours in court. So for a lot of small stuff, a lot of times, well, it depends on the type of person, but a lot of times for small stuff, people don't even want to go to court because it's going to cost them more than what they're going to get back out of it. But if you have made a verbal contract with somebody and then back out on your word, and then there is proof of this transaction, you can be held to it by law. It is just as legally binding as a written contract if you can have proof of it. So how would you get proof? And this kind of is pretty important in succession disputes, where somebody set up a business of some sort or promised somebody the farm, and then they go back on their word. The evidence that could be represented is if you kind of the same as the English law, like if you acted in your own detriment, like where you invested your own time and money, and you have proof of that, into the property, you made improvements, you did all this thing, you had the upkeep. If you have enough evidence of that, you could, by law, fight for this property that you were promised, that you worked hard on all those years. And you might not get the property, but you could be legally compensated, monetarily compensated. So for a lot of people out there, and this I'd never heard of before, I never knew it was a thing. A lot of these farms where somebody stays and they're going to take over and they're going to work the farm for all these years, and then they're going to have the landowners or some big dispute, and then they lose out. So the smart thing to do, if you would step into that, which nobody probably thinks of when they're taking somebody's word, is to keep track of all your receipts and everything you've done and everything you've paid for, because otherwise everything is just my word against your word, and it's really hard to prove. But the law is there that if you give a verbal contract, it is just as binding as a written contract if proof can be brought to light. I just thought that might be interesting for other people. It's really interesting to me. Y'all have a great and God blessed day.